Good morning. Welcome, everyone, to a great conversation about privacy today. I'd like to introduce Justin Antonipillai of Wirewheel, who will introduce our terrific panelists today. Justin?
Terrific. First of all, Dan, great to see you. I hope you had a great Thanksgiving here over the last weekend.
I did. Hopefully you did too.
We did. It's one of those strange Thanksgivings that I think I'm hoping a year from now, you and I will be able to look back on and just think that was one of the weirdest family events we've had. Half of our neighborhood was sitting outside on their driveways having Thanksgiving dinner with even their family or whoever happened to be. You could walk around the entire neighborhood and see them door to door. But feeling lucky overall, all things considered. But anyway, it's great to see you all. We are speaking on behalf of Dan and I. We are really excited for our panel today with two terrific guests. And this panel today is part of our second fall spokes conference that Wirewheel is putting on with an amazing lineup, starting today with this opening session and tomorrow with speakers from the European Commission, with the sponsor of the California Privacy Act, and amazing policy and national security experts. We're going to be talking about a whole host of technology and policy issues for our community. And consistent with our mission at Spokes, it's free and open to our entire community. And we always get excited about seeing law students and students come to just learn about what's going on in the area and benefit from these conversations. And with that, let me introduce our two speakers here today. Alex Reeve Givens is the president and CEO of the Center for Democracy and Technology, one of the leading institutions here in Washington, but really around the world in terms of thinking about technology policy from a lot of different angles. And Alex has an amazing background. I'm going to come back to you in one moment, Alex, to talk about it. And of course, our second guest today is Kerry. And Cam, both good friends of mine, but Cam last served in the Obama administration as the acting Secretary of Commerce. Before that, as the general counsel of the Department of Commerce. And I'm going to give you both the chance, if you don't mind, to talk a little bit about your backgrounds, which is just a helpful thing, if you don't mind. But let me start by saying welcome to both of you, and thank you for joining us on this privacy conversation with Dan and I.
Thanks for having us.
Well, thanks. It's great to be here.
Yeah, well, great. Well, and so let me start with you, Alex, if you wouldn't mind. Dan and I always like to start by just asking our guests to give a few minutes of background on what you've done and how you got to this leadership position in our community at CDT. And you serve both on the Hill and in other roles, including at Georgetown. But would you mind giving our viewers here a little bit of your background today?
Sure. Well, again, it's so nice to be with everyone today. I run the Center for Democracy and Technology, which is a 25-year-old think tank focused on making sure that technology works for people. We have offices in DC and also an office in Brussels. And the approach we bring is making sure that users' individual rights, civil liberties, are priorities in ongoing conversations about tech policy, and also design and architecture. So we have an interesting team that is both folks steeped in policy and technologists that can go that layer deeper to have in-depth conversation about how technology is designed and actually operates. We work on a really wide range of issues. So everything from platform governance and free expression to commercial privacy, to surveillance, to election security and election integrity, to internet architecture and internet standards, and how those end up having very significant impact on people's privacy and modes of communication as well. So it's a great organization. I've only been here for a year. I actually started my tenure as CEO in the middle of the pandemic. So I know my team through virtual meetings, sometimes try and do remote meetups when we can, but it's a privilege to be part of the organization, and it's been really fun so far. Before that, Justin, as you mentioned, I began my career on the Hill. I was on the, well, actually, I began it as a lawyer in private practice, but I began my policy career in the US Senate, working on the Senate Judiciary Committee. I was there for about 5 years working with Senator Leahy, who was the chairman and then the ranking member, working on a wide range of tech policy issues, from privacy to net neutrality issues, free expression, First Amendment issues, et cetera. And loved my time there. Got the experience of what it is to bring together vast coalitions of stakeholders to try and find that middle ground, which continues to inform my work today.
Oh, that's great, Alex. And well, as I said, it's great to have you here. And I know obviously the Judiciary Committee has such a heavy influence on where the antitrust agenda goes to. That's obviously going to be a core part of our conversation, which we can come back a little bit later on today. But as I said, great to have you here today. And now let me introduce Cam Kerry. And Cam, again, delighted to have you here today. Served a number of roles in the Obama administration and obviously beforehand, and have been leading a lot of the tech policy work at the Brookings Institution. So Cam, would you mind giving us a little bit of your background too?
Not at all, Justin. Thanks. So I spent a lot of my career as a lawyer in private practice and really in telecommunications law. So it involved technology, flows of information, but also sort of toggling between that and political campaigns, particularly my brother John Kerry's. But came to the Commerce Department early in the Obama administration, and I remember very well the sort of first conversation with the head of the Office of Presidential Personnel, who said, have you thought about general counsel at the Department of Commerce? And first thing I did was call a friend of mine who had served in the George W. Bush administration, like you, Justin, as the deputy general counsel and acting general counsel. And first words out of her mouth were, it's a dream job. And that's absolutely right. I mean, the Commerce Department, it's a little hard to get a handle on because it covers a broad range of things. It's sort of not like the Treasury Department, which does essentially one very big thing. But you look at the big issues today, the Commerce Department has a significant piece of every one of us. Trade, climate, it's got National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, the census, that was before the Supreme Court yesterday, and of course technology. The National Institute of Standards and Technology is there, the NTIA, all of which have significant roles in standards, technology, tech policy, internet policy. And I really saw a need to address that, as in terms of setting rules for the digital economy. And that really has become a major part of the Commerce Department role. So I led the Obama administration's work on the Consumer Privacy Bill of Rights and our international engagement. And my involvement in those issues has continued, both through the terrific platform of the Brookings Institution, really has pioneered the way for other think tanks, and through some years in private law practice. But really, a couple of years ago, as I saw, we were beginning a very serious debate about privacy legislation, decided I wanted to be free to engage as fully as possible in that. So I've been focused since then into really almost entirely on the Brookings work.
That's I appreciate that, Cam, and I'll ask one one quick last question to both of you before we dive into the subject today. Cam, you got a chance to serve in a cabinet meeting with your brother, which has got to be a little bit rare. I don't know if that's true or not, both as cabinet secretaries. And so maybe you could talk about that just briefly. I don't know if you remember that. And then Alex, I'll come to you in a moment, but not only is CDT known as one of the leaders on a number of different critical technology areas, which we're going to cover today, but you're also known as hosting one of the sort of main events in the technology policy world, which is sometimes called the Tech Prom. And in this time of COVID, maybe once Cam talks about his experience, you could talk about what CDT is doing about that next year. So Cam, but first, what it was like.
We did. I remember standing on Executive Drive between the West Wing and the Executive Office building for a while afterwards, and just the two of us talking and saying, this is pretty cool. It is the first time in history, the Commerce Department Library, look it up, that two siblings have served in a president's cabinet and at the same time. So we get that footnote in history. They can't take that away from us. I did learn that there's a comparable footnote in baseball. The two brothers who together have hit the most home runs in history. And the answer, of course, Hank Aaron famously hit 755, and Tommy Aaron hit 1. I think as a measure of our cabinet service, I think it's a fair comparison.
That's great. That's great. And Alex, back to you.
You've set the tone, you set the standard for siblings working together. I have one brother in film and one brother in TV, and I somehow got the boring policy part of our family gene pool. So I don't know if we're going to be replicating your success anytime soon, unless I pioneer career change. But yeah, so Justin, it's fun for you to mention Tech Prom. People in DC love a party, and CDT's Tech Prom has been kind of the big convening when people from civil society and academia and the Hill and the agencies all come together once a year. We call it Tech Prom. It is fun, but it's also an important moment, right? To suddenly, to put aside what can sometimes be pretty tough policy differences, pretty tough fights across the aisle, and just find these moments of community for people to come together and engage in the fact that we're all nerds that enjoy this stuff and find it interesting. This year we went virtual, so we did a web-based Tech Prom that worked pretty well. Next year we're hoping to have people back in person. We're holding it in October and hoping that this will be one of the first moments where people come out of their hibernation and hopefully are excited to see each other again as a community and be together in person.
Oh, that's great. Well, we're all looking forward to it, Alex. And well, speaking of jumping into policy, Dan, do you want to start, or shall I start with the first question for our guests today?
I guess, yeah, I'd like to kick it off because I think obviously we're in a really interesting time right now with the change in administration, and would love your thoughts on what you think that means for the future of privacy. Long been kicking around the possibility of a federal privacy law. Now we have folks in the White House that I think, would have a strong interest in that. What do you think, what do you see on the horizon at the federal level, given the new change?
Mm-hmm. Well, thanks. We do have people in the White House who care about that issue. Joe Biden is on record as supporting comprehensive privacy legislation. I think the challenge for this administration is going to be that it is very focused on sort of the four key challenges of the economic recovery, the pandemic, climate change, and a racial reckoning. And all all policies, all agencies are going to be focused on that and looking at issues through that prism. And I think the reality is that privacy legislation and some other tech issues are going to be second and third order issues in that scheme, but that doesn't mean that they are going to be forgotten. This is an administration, will be an administration that is committed to government, understands that government has broad responsibilities, and will have people in positions like OSTP, Office of Science and Technology Policy, the Commerce Department, who can carry the ball on issues like privacy and other technology issues. And I think it will be important to do that because these issues have a role in the broader scheme of things. If we are going to do, as part of the pandemic response, things like tracking apps, they need to be trusted. Broadband will be, and bridging the digital divide will certainly be part of infrastructure proposal. Part of how you empower people, enable people to deal with the pandemic. So having trusted technology will be important to that as well. So I think that privacy and other tech issues are going to have an important supporting role here.
Alex?
I think that's perfectly put. One of the things that strikes me when I think about the new administration coming in is just the unique severity of the moment we are in as a country and as a world, right? And one thing the pandemic has driven home more than ever is the severity of the digital divide. So to me, for example, there is no question that needs to be a piece of an administration coming in that's focused on racial equity and focused on economic equality. When we think of, 30% of students weren't able to participate in remote learning because they didn't have access to sufficient broadband access. And so those are the types of tech issues that I can see moving forward and hope that there is bipartisan momentum to support. And on the privacy piece, there's been really good progress over the past couple of years. The issues of the areas of disagreement narrowing down, us getting closer to an idea of what that package could look like. And so my hope is that, again, we can carry that momentum forward into the new administration. And even as we try to triage issues and the administration deals with the major crises they have on all fronts, acknowledging that privacy is a question of racial justice, right? We need to talk about data and discrimination, that we need to think about health privacy, right? We're in a world right now where so much of our health data is unregulated. Your Google search history can be a pretty good indicator of whether or not you've had COVID. What protections are in place to protect people about inferences made from those types of data stories? And so these are issues that need to stay top of mind for everyone. And I think the question will be just how do we create enough bandwidth and where are the areas that we can build consensus on the outside so that there is momentum and the administration can focus on that and run with it.
Yeah, and the Biden administration picks up where the Obama administration left off. When I left the Commerce Department, we were polishing off privacy legislation that you, Justin, and others sort of picked up and launched. It didn't get done then. There is, as Alex said, the opportunity to do that now. But in that, and to pick up on a lot of other issues that were left on the table at the end of the Obama administration. The impact of AI on the future of work, on discrimination, and all those issues are still out there, but everything has moved on. We understand a lot more about algorithms, about discrimination. AI is more more advanced. And I think, in a broader sense, that's true as well. The Obama administration came in having to do an economic recovery. So, in some sense, it's deja vu all over again. But, the issues, the challenges have changed. The challenges internationally have changed. So it will be a different discussion. And I think that's true on privacy. Now Congress is taking the initiative, but a lot of good work has been done. But having an administration that's at the table can help to close those gaps and maybe get the job done.
Cam and Alex, both perfect places to start. And I completely agree. Right now, you have an administration coming in with a really full plate of very high priority global crises to deal with. I think absolutely number one is going to be helping us deal with COVID. And we've all seen how much focus the president-elect is bringing to that issue. There's an amazingly broad set of economic challenges where folks are just worried about their jobs, and small businesses in our communities, restaurants that we've gone to for 20 years that are just really suffering. And, obviously other issues that are going to be at the top of the policy agenda. And notwithstanding all of that, I think there are going to have to be some key areas where the new administration and Congress are going to focus when it comes to tech policy. And you've highlighted a few of them, but I thought I might pick up the string with two questions that we can talk about. The first is, Alex, both you and Cam implicitly kind of covered that there's going to be almost naturally a lot of overlap between the new incoming Biden administration, Biden 1, and where Obama 2, the second administration, left off. And you can even see how much overlap there is in the key leadership positions. So one question I'd ask both of you is, do you have a sense of how much Biden 1 will be a continuation of Obama's second term when it comes to tech policy? And do you have a sense about where you think the major differences might be? And the second item that I might put on the table, just because it's coming up in virtually every topic around tech, is the role of Section 230, as it's called, of the Communications Decency Act. And if either one of you are going to jump into Section 230, I will ask you, make sure to explain and remind everybody what that is and why that's become an important issue. But those are the two that I might start us with today.
Mm-hmm.
Ken, why don't you kick off with Obama 2 to Biden 1, and then I'll jump in on 230.
Sounds good. Okay. So let me sort of elaborate by what I mean about picking up, but where the Obama administration left off, but in a different place. We're in a different environment as far as tech issues. Certainly seen in the past few years the emergence of techlash. Section 230 is certainly one of the hotspots in that debate. But that's true in privacy as well. When I was framing the Consumer Privacy Bill of Rights and moving from a policy paper to legislation, we did a lot of work on trying to find allies on the Hill to partner with us on the legislation, and we couldn't find any. People did not see that as a major issue. That has been transformed by the explosion of data breaches, and of course, the Cambridge Analytica story. And so we saw all of the congressional hearings, and lots of people have been introducing bills. So we're not this administration is not going to be writing on a clean slate. It's going to have to work with stakeholders, CDT, industry, and others who have been very engaged in this over the last couple of years, and with senior members on the Hill. Senator Wicker is now the forgot to turn notifications off. With Senator Cantwell, who from Washington, who's the ranking member of that committee. Both of them and lots of other people put a lot of time into this issue. They've been debating it, so you're going to have to become a part of that conversation and help to move that forward. And I think that's true on a lot of other issues, like Section 230.
So Alex, that's a perfect segue. What is Section 230 and why is this hitting anyone's radar?
Sure. So Section 230 is the US law that says that online intermediaries aren't responsible for what users post on their services. And then there's something called the Good Samaritan provision in there, which is the notion that they're not responsible if they respond to harmful content on their sites. It's an essential foundation of the internet. You can think about Yelp as an example, right? A service that exists to post others' feedback on businesses. Absent protections, there is a chance that a website such as Yelp would feel very anxious about and likely would not host those types of comments if there's a chance that they could be responsible for the content of those posts and be in the middle of those conversations. So that is the structure of 230. Why is everybody talking about it? Section 230 has been around for a long time. We're in a world now where obviously the internet is far more than just review sites like Yelp. And instead, platforms are the mediators of the primary way a lot of us get information, how people access news, how people access community, how people find new ideas and new sources of information. And there's been a lot of data and evidence shown about polarization that comes about online, concerns about hate speech, about misinformation or targeted disinformation, which is intentionally manipulating information to mislead people. Concerns about voter suppression, which was a big conversation in the run-up to the 2020 elections. And so in this framework, there is now a big public conversation that really comes down to two different sides. Are platforms doing enough to respond to those types of forces online? Or are they doing too much or doing it with a particular bent? What we've seen over the past 12 months in particular, but even extending before that, is a real politicization of this conversation. So President Trump issued an executive order earlier this year, for example, that really sought to deter social media platforms from moderating content on their services. The concern in the allegation was that platforms, in their efforts to respond to misinformation or voter suppression, were silencing conservative voices at a different rate or more so than they were doing for more liberal or progressive voices. That actually hasn't been borne out with any factual record, but it's a concern that has been widely repeated and has now caught wind, both with the executive order by President Trump, a proposed rulemaking at the Federal Communications Commission, and a number of legislative initiatives that have been introduced in Congress. So what happens next for all of this? Vice President Biden, President-elect Biden, has expressed real concerns about 230. He comes at it from the other side, worried that social media services aren't doing enough to respond to harmful content on their sites. So it still remains an open question as to how we move from this very politicized conversation of the past 12 months or so to instead have what I hope will be a much more rational conversation around what content moderation looks like. Any of that conversation has to happen against the backstop notion that there is only so much that Congress or an administration could ever require platforms to do. We have a First Amendment. It is deeply important, seminal to our nation. And so even if there is content that is awful but lawful, it's actually not possible to regulate or force platforms to take that down. That makes these conversations really hard because frankly, we're dealing with some of the worst aspects of humanity reflected on the internet, and this hard feeling. The lawmakers and policymakers want to do something about it, but how do they do that in a way that, number one, is constitutional, but number two, doesn't end up having a chilling effect on free expression and good community online? This concern that if platforms suddenly were responsible for all of the content that's on their services, what does that mean for kind of marginal fringe speech? If they start to feel worried about legal liability for what's happening in particular chat rooms, do chat room features continue as a feature of the internet? And so there are these really seminal foundational questions about free expression and how we find community online that get wrapped up in these conversations. So for that reason, I don't think there's an easy legislative fix that comes out of this. I think there will continue to be smart and important oversight conversations on Capitol Hill. One of the things that I think is really important to focus on is what the platforms are doing, because they can do so much more than Congress or an administration could ever mandate them to do. So there's a really important lever here of what social pressure is being put on companies, what market pressure is being put on companies to use their content moderation terms of service thoughtfully, responsibly, transparently, and with due process mechanisms built in. So this is what CDT spends a lot of time thinking about, is how do we put pressure on companies that wield such decision-making power as to how this information is presented and filtered online, to think about how they wield that power, and to build in checks, balances, and processes so there can be more accountability and users can build up really what is a trust deficit, I would say right now, with a number of the major platforms.
Yeah, CDT spends a lot of time thinking about that issue, and it's evident in a very wise and thoughtful description of the issue. And I think what that reflects is there's a lot of bipartisan consensus that that a lot of speech on social media platforms is a problem, and that we ought to do something about it. And very little consensus about what that something should be.
Ironically, I think I find the whole thing very weird with 230, because what the Trump proposes, getting rid of it, would actually cut against what he actually wants, because it would in fact lead to more moderation, I think, rather than less. 230 essentially immunizes a platform from doing any moderation at all. It really doesn't have to under 230. And getting rid of it will in fact lead to more moderation and more crackdown on the very kind of speech that Trump is engaging in. So I think it's very ironic and almost humorous what he wants to do. I've long thought 230 has been a problem, not actually in the text of what 230 actually says. I actually think what 230 says in its words is actually a good law. It's the way courts have interpreted 230 to become this much more blanket immunity that starts to create rules for the internet that are very different than anywhere else, a kind of exceptional universe for online speech that's very different from offline speech. So in a way, I kind of would personally think like a 230 Restoration Act to restore it to what it actually says, rather than what courts have twisted it into being, would be, I think, a good thing. And I think that greater platform responsibility is a long time coming. I think that right now, unfortunately, I think they are struggling to do a good job because this is not their thing. And they haven't really put a lot of time or resources into thinking about how do we do this exceedingly well. They kind of do it, but I think there's a lot of room for improvement. So maybe the law can nudge them to get it better and balance this. I wonder though, will this conversation keep going? After Trump is out of office, will the urge to do something about 230 kind of disappear once this is over, or do you think that this really is the day that 230 will be revisited in Congress?
I think the conversation about platform governance is here to stay, right? It's such an important force in our lives, in our democratic institutions, that's not going anywhere fast. What I hope will happen is that, number one, it'll move away from some of the politicization of the past year. I mean, you pointed out one of the fundamental inconsistencies of the executive order. The other is just how almost vicious or unabashed those legislative efforts are in the type of content moderation they would permit versus the type of content moderation that would trigger platforms losing their immunity. And it's responding to misinformation, it's responding to voter suppression, it's responding to hate speech. Those things suddenly are removed from the Good Samaritan protections, and platforms would no longer get immunity if they engaged in that type of moderation. That's just a toxic approach, in my opinion, to be bringing to a legislative vehicle. And so my hope is that that wanes, and instead it's a more thoughtful conversation around how content moderation can happen. I will say, two more things on that. One, it is very, very hard to legislate this. It is, legislation is by definition a broad tool with a very specific shape. And what you're trying to do is balance the incentives for companies to have them take responsible actions, but not do it in such a way that they end up chilling lawful speech or speech that is beneficial, right? Ways for communities to find each other online. It is very hard to calibrate something in writing that achieves that goal. And so I think it's going to take a lot of time and thought for the conversation to progress. In the meantime, though, one thing that we've really seen this year is platforms, in part, actually largely thanks to, I would say, the 2020 general election, platforms being much more nuanced in how they think about their tools and content moderation, right? We always used to have these conversations about take up, take down, and that's kind of the instrument that they have. We're in a different world now, right? Where there are click-through windows, there are conversations about whether something can be promoted in an algorithm or should be taken out of a recommendation algorithm. There are fact-check boxes that appear around things. There's Twitter trying to get people to check whether they've read an article before they can retweet it, which feels like someone like rapping you on the knuckles for being too fast on your phone. Which shows to me that there is a growing sophistication in these conversations around what type of tools to see. It doesn't mean that the platforms are all there yet in terms of having good practices, but I've welcomed that discussion. And at the same time, too, welcome things like the Facebook Oversight Board, which sure enough does have some problems, some reasons that we in civil society and others have been criticizing it, but is a really interesting and important experiment in what is it for one of these platforms to have a formal process for due process challenges when people's content is taken down. They actually have announced their first cases today. And so for the first time, civil society groups will be able to look at those practices, weigh in, start giving comments, have public dialogue about this in a much more transparent manner. So we have a long way to go, but I do think that the type of movement that we've seen this year shows real progress. And the last point I'll make on that before passing it back to Kim is some of this is also, when we think about priorities for the administration and for folks on the Hill, some of this is going to just have to come down to triage. So there are only so many issues that you can deal with as an administration. We began this conversation talking about the deeply important fundamental crises facing the country right now. So in the tech policy space, what we're trying to spend time thinking about at CDT is, of all the tools in the toolkit or the things to really push forward this year, where do we think there can actually be progress in a way that makes a material difference in consumers' lives? And how does the privacy conversation fit with the content moderation conversation, fit with the antitrust conversation? How do we think about that suite of tools? And if we only get one, or if we need to try and come up with the right legislative package to move, what is the right set of things to really be fighting for hard? We think that privacy is the one, just because there's been so much progress so far. It feels closer to the finish line, and it has such a significant impact for people across the nation in many different sectors. But regardless of whether you agree with that assessment, I think that conversation of which priority to choose and how they fit together is going to be really critical.
And I certainly agree with that. Alex's suggestion of privacy as the priority for exactly the reason that she mentioned, that so much work has gone into this over the past 3 years, and it is close enough. The Wicker bills, the Cantwell bill are within shouting distance of each other on a lot of issues. And there are serious discussions underway about how to sort of bridge the big gaps on private rights of action, on preemption. And I think there's the possibility for those to bear fruit. And as we heard, I think there's a much longer and less developed discussion to take place on Section 230. I think the same is true for competition. And Congressman Cicilline's proposed an antitrust bill. There'll be discussion of that, but antitrust legislation does not happen easily. So that's a long-term proposition, and I think there may be some things to do with competition enforcement in the meantime, but those are going to take some time to ramp up too, because you got to get people in sitting in seats at the Justice Department, at the FTC, and they've got to get ramped up. So that's down the road. I think the possibility to move forward on privacy, starting pretty quickly, is there based on all the good work that's been done.
Yeah, and if I may, but by the way, great points on both. There has been some great publishing going on by CDT on this issue, which I think is worthy of highlighting for the community. So maybe we can post that at some point here, Alex. Very, very thoughtful. And of course, one of the key tenets here, it is almost the most offensive versions of the comments that in some ways are the kind that you have to protect in a funny way. That's the whole purpose of it, right? It's the ones that I find offensive that we still have to make sure that we're considering and leaving space under the First Amendment. And that highlights some of the hardest issues that when it comes up around legislation around this issue. So I do understand why 230 has become such a sort of central rod on this issue. But I think the second point you were both making around tech policy, which is there is a moment here in which, in this moment of COVID, where there's some very practical, very necessary considerations that have to happen around how we're going to reopen our economy, reopen our country here in the next, hopefully, couple of months to a year. It was exciting to me to watch the evening news, which, by the way, my kids just mock me that I even watch the evening news. They're like, what is this? Why are we watching this? But anyway, I was watching the evening news last night, and to see around the world that they're literally shipping containers of the vaccine to different parts of the world so that the minute there's a go-ahead, they can start vaccinating. So it's hopefully not too long off that one might have, at least for certain high-risk groups, some vaccines out there. But just think of the consequences of all of our workplaces and trying to implement this, get people back to work, make sure it's done respectfully, make sure it's done in a way that considers not only the health of your teammates, but the privacy considerations. I mean, the way that works. I highlight this because it's one of those moments in which you might just have enough urgency and enough need to pass something nationally that considers the privacy implications of what's happening quickly. Because I think what we've talked about is it has to be a high priority item. It has to be an issue that's going to be critical if we're going to get it onto the agenda here as a matter. And so here's a question for both of you. In the core scope of the privacy law that we were talking about, do some of the COVID related considerations give us that urgency where we could pass maybe one of the first national privacy laws? And if that is going to be considered, Cam, one question I might ask you, and obviously Alex, I'm sure you could weigh in too, on this issue. When this issue of a national privacy law of any kind has come up, there's this interagency process that occurs in the federal government, Cam, that very few people have ever heard of. And it's not like it's like published in your normal government textbook. And in that process, the national security agencies, the Department of Justice have a very heavy voice in what happens on a bill like this. So how do you see the conversation going around this privacy law in the time of COVID? And what do you think the voice of the national security or intelligence agencies, how will that end up influencing something in that vein? I'd open it to either of you. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, Alex, why don't you go ahead and sort of talk about the COVID aspects of this, and I can then jump in on some more on that and on the national security piece.
Well, there was a time at the beginning of the pandemic where there was real movement for a moment around a COVID-specific privacy bill. And in the end, just the oxygen wasn't there between other priorities. But I do think that COVID has driven home some really important lessons about how important privacy is. And as we think about what the move out from this phase looks like, the swaths of the American people that are now going to have what could be deemed a pre-existing health condition, right? And that could be revealed through something that is your health data, but isn't protected by HIPAA, which is the traditional way in which we protect medical related information when it's held by your health provider. Now, devices all around us collect health related data all the time. And so I do hope that those types of instances help drive home the need for this reform. And we can use it as you say, kind of the motivational hook to get people really focused on the importance of these questions. So that's the hope. On the other hand, we do know just how many priorities there are. So whether you get something right out the gate that's COVID tailored feels like it might be a stretch in the privacy space. But I think still this could fit in well for 2021 priorities, just to again use this moment to push for the reform that we've all been fighting for so long.
Yeah. So ditto to everything that Alex said. And we saw that very COVID specific privacy bills ran up against exactly the same issues that comprehensive privacy did. So at the end of the day, I think strunk and white and elements of style said sometimes the longest way around is the best shortcut. I think that probably applies to privacy legislation. And in an ideal world, that would harmonize other regimes, financial records. We're going to face important privacy issues on employment as people go back to work, and testing becomes part of that. And we have workplace monitoring of remote work, and there's a host of issues there to deal with. But I think the important thing right now is let's deal with the sort of vast sectors of our economy that are not covered on existing sectoral regimes, and then move on to the job of harmonizing HIPAA, FCRA, other legislation to the way that we're protecting privacy in other spheres. I think at the end of the day, it's better for consumers if they're dealing with the same set of rules, no matter what kind of data they're dealing with, no matter what kind of company they are dealing with.
I think.
Go ahead,
Yeah,
Dan.
I think I've always looked at the federal law as being very, optimistic in its thinking. I think it'd be great to have one, but the hurdles that strike me as really hard are less the private right of action and more what do we do with the existing sectoral laws? We don't get rid of HIPAA or other laws. So how do we integrate all them into the mix with the comprehensive law, which there's a lot of gaps in the sectoral approach, but there's also a lot of overlap where a lot of companies are regulated by not just one law, but many, many different laws with many, many different definitions of what falls under those laws. Can be very confusing. And then to see, okay, do we, have both the comprehensive law and this new law apply? And then, what does the FTC do because its jurisdiction overlaps? Then the preemption issue, I think, is really hard, because if you're doing a comprehensive law, you could preempt thousands of other privacy laws around the country that have something to touch on privacy. Just saying we preempt all laws about privacy. Well, what's privacy and what's covered and all those issues? So how do we figure out preemption? And then ultimately, how do we get California to go along? Because given the razor thin division, or the very, very close division in the House, and such a large contingent from California, the laws better be awesome for Californians to vote to essentially get rid of their power. So why would they do that? What would entice them to do that? And then would a law that would do that kind of thing also make the Republicans happy? So it just wonder, is this a tightrope that is possible to walk? Or is it ultimately going to run into some problems where there are just some compromises that I'm not sure folks are willing to make? Like maybe you don't do preemption, which is what I think, but I don't see enough people coming to the table on that. So I guess where do you see the potential breakthrough being, or the possibility? Because when I look, I do see some of these hurdles, and I'm not sure we can readily jump those hurdles so easily.
Well, I'm a congenital optimist, man. So I'll take the optimistic scenario. Look, I think there are members of the California delegation who recognize that even with CPRA, it is not an optimal law, and think a federal law can do better. I think some form of private right of action can be part of that equation. I think as there certainly are some members of industry who will say, look, I think some kind of private right of action is what it's going to take, and in part to get a single national standard. Obviously, it's not as we've talked about, not going to cover absolutely every sector. And I think, to me, the best, the reason that I support issue preemption is to sort of sidestep the preemption of all state laws and deal with the issue on the federal law on a case-by-case basis. And I think, I think there's space to do those things. And I think to make a federal law that addresses algorithms, that addresses discrimination in ways that will take it beyond California. In some respects, we do algorithms and civil rights beyond GDPR. So, I think there is a path.
Do you think that the path is better strategized as trying the comprehensive route, or trying more targeted laws, like a law just about, algorithmic transparency and algorithmic discrimination, a law just about biometric privacy, to try to do this piecemeal rather than bundle it all up into one giant package that's going to do, everything, versus just trying more targeted laws that may have a better chance of getting a consensus?
Alex, you want to take that one?
The idea of doing it in the patchwork way just hurts my heart, because we already have such a fragmented privacy system that I think it's, as a nation, that's not a smart route for us to go down. The other piece is that I think it's hard to get the grand bargain that way. On the algorithmic fairness piece, there might be more agreement around what transparency looks like, but there are a lot of people who would want to hold out on that for a bigger package. So I think that it would take a lot of political strategy to be breaking off those pieces. And in the end, I don't know if that's the smartest way for us to go as people that really do want to have a comprehensive fabric to protect consumers' rights.
And
but what Alex says makes good sense. That a lot of these issues get diluted in the context of a comprehensive bill. Take a look at the difficulties with doing data breach, data security legislation, but a data security provision as part of a comprehensive privacy bill has been almost completely uncontroversial.
So, as I expected, we've used up a huge amount of time on a phenomenal bunch of subjects. And I know we had one last question we were going to ask both of you as we hit the end of our hour. By the way, just a phenomenal discussion on a lot of these subjects. And for example, Cam, tomorrow, Alistair McTaggart will be appearing at Spokes, and I'm sure he has a view on how California's law stands and whether there ought to be preemption. I'll make sure to raise some of these points with him tomorrow. And it's interesting. We didn't cover this, but a lot of the same issues, almost exactly the same issues, are coming up in Europe. I know CDT has written about this as well, so has Brookings, but a lot of the same data monopoly, a lot of the same issues around the platform regulation are critical in Europe. And as you know, Bruno Gencarelli from the European Commission will be speaking there as well. So there'll be some interesting continuation of these critical subjects. So as we're wrapping up, here's a question for each of you, and it can be on something we've covered or something else. But is there a tech policy issue that is important, that is on the radar, but that people might not be paying attention to? There's a lot of them, but we haven't talked about, antitrust or otherwise. But are there ones out there that each of you are paying attention to that may not be hitting folks' radar right now?
I'll start with one that is on folks' radar but hasn't been in our conversation. So I'm going to shoehorn it in because I think it's so important. And that's what the Federal Trade Commission is doing now, even while we have these conversations around what legislation could look like that would hopefully give it more resources and more authority. We have the chance for the FTC to really play a role in this space and hopefully to continue its really critical role as a watchdog and thinking through how it steps up its use of that authority. Commissioner Slaughter and Commissioner Chopra, who are two of the commissioners currently at the FTC, have written really powerfully around this. But thinking through much more creatively and hopefully assertively how the FTC is using its unfairness authority, for example, to go after egregious privacy abuses or some of the data discrimination issues that we're seeing. Continuing to push on what theories of harm are to make sure we're talking not just about economic harm, but informational harm as well. And continue to think through what some of the remedies they're pushing for in these cases. So I think regardless of what's happening on Capitol Hill and all the busyness that's going to be happening on a whole wide range of policy issues, seeing how the FTC is using its authority and what cases it's choosing to prioritize and lean into is going to be a fascinating and important thing to watch over the next couple of years.
Oh, that's a good catch, Alex. You're right. Cam, what do you think?
So I want to focus on something we've alluded to a little bit, which is the connection between privacy and civil rights. And certainly in important respects, privacy is a civil right. But I think the connection between the use of personal data in forms of discrimination is something that we need to address as part of privacy legislation. Privacy legislation is, in that sense, a civil rights issue. It's one that has really emerged in this debate over just the last few years. It's one of those things that I think has changed from the end of the Obama administration until now. And there's a great deal of concern among people of color and other disadvantaged communities about the ways that data can be used. So we need to make sure that is part of privacy legislation. And I think to sort of circle back to the beginning of our conversation, it is one of the ways the privacy legislation addresses the racial reckoning that is so central to the issues we face going forward.
Well, I totally agree there. And I think that's one of those issues that often gets lost as well, Cam, is how much some of these policy decisions do affect fundamental civil rights in a lot of different ways. So I think it's a great point. Let me just say, both Alex and Cam, thank you very much for appearing with Dan and I today. Alex, you and CDT are leading on a number of these critical issues, and I think our community would be well served by going to the CDT site and seeing some of the research and publications that are coming out, because there's a real wealth and depth of knowledge that CDT puts out regularly on these issues. And of course, Cam has been leading on a similar, just very deep set of issues, certainly on national privacy legislation. If viewers haven't been, please go to the Brookings site and look at some of the recent publications that Cam and a broad team of very deep experts on privacy have been publishing. It's been very thoughtful, and I think is really helping to move that conversation forward. But amazingly, we didn't even cover antitrust at all. I hope that means that Dan and I will be able to welcome you both back on a session in the future, because there's a lot more to talk about, but between the both of us. But I really appreciate, and I know Dan does too, you both joining us today. I hope you'll join us for Spokes tomorrow. And I look forward to a lot of really, really exciting conversations around this in the next 4 years.
This has been great. Thanks for having us.
Thanks so much, Justin. Thanks, Dan.
Thanks for joining us.
Yeah. We'll see you all soon.
Bye-bye.